My daughter thought I had become a burden. She and her family whispered behind my back, nudging each other to be patient with my slowness out of politeness. And then, one day, they said it to my face that I was too slow to live with them. I sat there, silent, listening, as if their words were true. But when they left for work, I showed them just how quickly I could move, and when they came home, their belongings were already waiting for them on the front lawn. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Barbara Miller. I was 68 years old when I packed the last of my belongings into 3 battered suitcases and left the house where Harold and I had raised our family. After he passed, the walls of that home felt too wide, too full of memories pressing down on me like the summer heat that clung to St. Charles, Missouri every August. It wasn't just the silence that made it unbearable. It was the way the silence carried echoes of laughter, of arguments, of dreams whispered late into the night. The house was a museum of a life that no longer existed. When my daughter Caroline suggested I move in with her and her husband Trevor, it seemed like a blessing. She said it so easily, in the calm, matter-of-fact tone she had always used when solving other people's problems. "Mom, it just makes sense," she said. "You shouldn't be alone." And I, tired of rattling around in empty rooms, tired of the endless repairs, the leaking pipes, the sagging porch steps, agreed without thinking too much. Their house was newer, bigger, tucked away in a well-manicured subdivision where every lawn was trimmed with military precision and every mailbox gleamed under the afternoon sun. The house itself had a wide front porch with rocking chairs I never saw anyone use, and large windows framed by neatly ironed curtains. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new carpet. It was not a place that had grown into itself yet. It was a place still waiting to become a home. Caroline and Trevor had carved out a space for me on the first floor, a small guest bedroom that overlooked the backyard. They had placed a bed against one wall, a dresser by the window, and a tiny writing desk pushed into the corner. On the bed was a floral quilt I recognized from my old guest room, one I had sewn myself years ago when my hands were steadier and my eyes sharper. That little touch made me believe, for a moment, that this could work. In the beginning, it did. I kept myself busy, finding small ways to be helpful. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, swept the porch. Carolyn praised my efforts politely but distractedly, the way one might commend a child for making their bed. Trevor thanked me once for mending a tear in his work shirt, but the gratitude was brief, already fading from his mind before he finished speaking. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that families adapt, that it would take time for us to find a rhythm. After all, I had spent decades teaching children how to navigate the world. Surely I could relearn how to belong in my own daughter's home. But the subtle signals of discomfort were there from the start, even if I chose not to see them. The way Caroline rearranged the kitchen after I organized it. The way Trevor sighed when I took too long tying my shoes at the door. The way conversations at dinner seemed to speed past me, leaving me nodding politely, too slow to catch the current. Little things almost invisible at first, like hairline cracks in a window pane. But given enough pressure, even the smallest cracks can split wide open. I tried harder. I kept to myself more, retreating to my room after dinner, listening to the television hum through the thin walls. I declined invitations to join them on outings, sensing the relief behind their forced insistence. I told myself that solitude was preferable to being a burden. There were moments, of course, when I let myself dream otherwise. Mornings when I would sip coffee on the porch and imagine Caroline joining me. the two of us wrapped in quiet conversation the way we once had when she was a little girl. Afternoons when I heard laughter from the living room and wished it included me. Evenings when I watched the sunset through my small bedroom window and remembered how it felt to be needed. But reality, as it often does, had sharper edges. I began to notice the looks they exchanged over my head when I spoke too slowly or asked them to repeat themselves. I noticed the way Trevor adjusted his watch every time I hesitated before answering a question. I noticed how Caroline's voice tightened when she had to explain something to me twice. Slow. The words settled into my chest like a stone. I had never thought of myself that way before. I had taught generations of children, managed households, volunteered at the library, organized community events. I had built a life one careful brick at a time. But now, at 68, my measured steps, my deliberate speech, my thoughtfulness, all the things that once served me well, had become liabilities. They didn't say it out loud, not at first. But words are not the only way we communicate disappointment. It was in the way Caroline stopped asking for my opinion on household matters. It was in the way Trevor increasingly referred to me in the third person when speaking to the children, as if I were a piece of furniture someone had placed awkwardly in the living room. It was in the way they began to treat me not as a participant in their lives, but as an obstacle to be worked around. Still, I held on because that is what you do when you love someone. You hold on longer than you should. You find excuses for them. You convince yourself that the fault must be yours, that if you just tried a little harder, smiled a little more, stayed a little quieter, things would go back to how they were. But houses built on cracks eventually fall, and so do illusions. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, where my simple question about the children's school schedules was met with sighs and sidelong glances, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared out the window into the growing dark. The backyard was empty, the swing set Trevor had built for the kids standing silent and still. I thought about all the years I had spent building a life, not perfect, but real, full of laughter and arguments and ordinary days that stitched themselves into something lasting. I thought about Harold, about how he would have squeezed my hand and told me that home was wherever we were together. And I realized, with a clarity that hurt more than it healed, that I was no longer home. I was a guest, a tolerated inconvenience, a relic of a life they had outgrown. The quiet, stubborn part of me, the part that had seen generations of children bloom under my patient guidance, stirred awake. It whispered that I was not done yet, that I deserved more than a dusty corner of someone else's life. That speed had never been the measure of a life's worth. I sat there for a long time, the house settling around me, the clock ticking steadily in the hall, and somewhere deep inside me, a decision began to take root. They thought I was slow. They thought wrong. At first, the cracks appeared so subtly that I almost convinced myself they weren't there. Life with Caroline and Trevor followed a quiet, predictable pattern. I woke early, long before the rest of the household stirred, and tiptoed through my morning routine so as not to disturb anyone. I would brew coffee, sitting by the kitchen window in the dim light, watching the world wake up. By the time Caroline came downstairs, perfectly dressed and composed, I had already wiped down the counters, straightened the living room, and fed the cat. She would smile, sometimes, distractedly, muttering a thank you under her breath while scrolling through her phone. I took what I could get, wearing her casual acknowledgments like medals pinned to a hollow uniform. Trevor, on the other hand, rarely spoke to me unless it was necessary. In the beginning, I attributed it to stress from work, a demanding job he often grumbled about at the dinner table. But as the weeks passed, The glances he gave me became shorter, less patient. His tolerance thinned with each passing day, a rope fraying thread by thread. The first real sign came one Saturday morning when I attempted to help in the garden. It had been years since I worked the soil, but my hands remembered the motions even if my knees protested. I knelt carefully beside the flower beds, pulling stubborn weeds that threatened Caroline's meticulously arranged rose bushes. I lost track of time, the feel of the earth between my fingers soothing something raw inside me. When Caroline found me, her smile was tight, almost brittle. She told me that next time I should just leave it to the landscapers. Her words were light, almost playful on the surface, but the undertone was sharp, unmistakable. She didn't want my help. She didn't want my presence leaving traces on her polished life. The second sign came during family dinner. I had offered to cook a meal, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, the kind of meal Harold and I used to enjoy together on Sunday evenings. I spent hours preparing it, humming softly to myself, filling the house with the warm, comforting smells of home. When the meal was finally served, Carolyn picked at her plate politely, but Trevor made no effort to hide his dissatisfaction. "It's a little dry," he said, pushing his food around with his fork, not even looking up at me. "Maybe next time we could just order out." The casual cruelty of it stunned me. I smiled and nodded, swallowing the thick lump rising in my throat. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had cooked for myself, for the memory of a home that no longer existed. But in the silence that followed, the meal I had prepared with such care turned to ash in my mouth. From that night on, family dinners became increasingly rare. Caroline and Trevor often claimed late work meetings, school events, anything to avoid sitting down with me. I ate most of my meals alone, a quiet figure at the end of a long dining table meant for laughter and conversation. The small humiliations accumulated day by day. One afternoon, I overheard Trevor telling a neighbor that it was a real adjustment having Barbara around, his voice laced with forced patience. Another time, Caroline offered to buy me a tablet so I could keep myself entertained instead of getting underfoot. She said it with a laugh, but the message was clear. I was an old piece of furniture they had reluctantly inherited and didn't know quite where to put. Even the children, once so warm and eager to spend time with me, began to follow the cues of their parents. They stopped asking me to read them bedtime stories. They stopped inviting me to their soccer games or piano recitals. They learned, as children always do, by watching the adults around them, absorbing the silent lessons taught in glances and sighs and the subtle shifts of body language. Still, I tried. I offered to help with homework, to run errands, to babysit when schedules grew complicated. Every offer was met with a polite refusal, as if my very willingness to be useful was a burden they had to gently decline. I found myself retreating more and more to my small bedroom, the walls closing in a little tighter each day. I filled my time with crossword puzzles, knitting projects, old novels reread until the pages grew limp from use. I took long walks around the neighborhood, admiring the neatly trimmed lawns and the rows of identical mailboxes, pretending that I belonged here among the carefully curated lives. But even outside the house, I could feel it. The slight hesitations of neighbors, the glances that slid away too quickly, the subtle exclusion from conversations. I was not part of this world. I was tolerated at best. The final, undeniable crack came one morning when I misplaced my keys. I had set them down in the kitchen, distracted while unloading groceries, and when I couldn't find them, panic rose swift and sharp in my chest. I searched every surface, every drawer, retracing my steps over and over. Caroline found me in the kitchen, tears stinging my eyes, fumbling with a handful of receipts and loose change. "Mom," she said, exasperation bleeding through her carefully measured tone, "you're just slowing down, that's all." She smiled after she said it, as if softening the blow, but the damage had already been done. Slowing down. The words echoed in my ears long after she left the room. I found the keys later, tucked beneath a bag of apples on the counter. But it wasn't the keys that mattered anymore. It was the understanding that had settled, cold and heavy, in my chest. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how small I made myself, no matter how much of my former life I left behind at their doorstep, I would never be fast enough, sharp enough, young enough to fit into their world again. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were gaping chasms now, splitting the foundation of everything I had tried so desperately to rebuild. And somewhere deep inside, a new resolve began to stir. If they thought I was slow, if they believed I was an inconvenience, they were about to see just how quickly I could move when it truly mattered. The morning of the conversation began like any other. I woke up before the rest of the house, the early gray light barely filtering through the slats of the blinds in my small bedroom. I moved carefully, easing aching joints into motion, dressing in my usual slacks and a soft sweater, the fabric thinned from countless washes. I padded quietly down the hallway and into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking faintly under my slippers. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the pantry door. I busied myself making coffee, moving with the slow efficiency that had once served me so well in the busy mornings of a younger life. I pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, knowing Caroline and Trevor would be down soon. I had always believed that small kindnesses built the foundation of a home, and though cracks had long formed in ours, I kept laying those bricks, stubborn and hopeful. I was stirring sugar into my cup when I heard the muffled thud of footsteps overhead. A few minutes later, Caroline's voice floated down the stairs, low and clipped, followed by Trevor's gruff reply. I didn't catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Irritation, tension brewing just beneath the surface. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands cradling the warm mug, pretending not to hear. A lifetime of motherhood had taught me the art of selective deafness. Still, something in the air felt heavier that morning, the kind of weight that precedes a storm. Caroline entered the kitchen first, her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, her eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of too many restless nights. She moved briskly, pulling cereal boxes from the pantry, pouring orange juice into glasses. Trevor followed, his shirt untucked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. They barely acknowledged me. I sat there, small and invisible, sipping my coffee and trying not to intrude on the delicate tension that crackled between them. Then Caroline spoke. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" Her voice was too casual, too rehearsed. The way she perched on the edge of the chair across from me, the way Trevor leaned silently against the counter with his arms crossed, told me everything before she even opened her mouth again. I set down my mug carefully, bracing myself against the cold knot forming in my stomach. Caroline cleared her throat, glancing at Trevor for support before turning back to me. "We've been thinking," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as if choosing them carefully would soften the blow. "It's just, things have been feeling a little crowded lately." Crowded. I looked around the kitchen. The wide countertops, the 6-seat dining table, the cavernous open floor plan that could have hosted a small army. Crowded. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Caroline took that as permission to continue. "It's not that we don't want you here, Mom. It's just, with work, the kids, the schedules, and everything, it's getting harder to manage. And we've noticed, well, you seem to struggle with keeping up. Struggle. The word landed heavier than it should have. Trevor shifted, clearing his throat. He picked up where Caroline left off, his voice low and measured, like he was explaining something to a difficult client. We think it might be better for everyone if you had a place more suited to your pace. My pace. I swallowed hard, forcing down the sharp sting of humiliation rising in my chest. Caroline smiled, a brittle, anxious thing. There are some lovely senior communities nearby. Independent living, lots of amenities, people your age. It could be really good for you. Good for me. As if being pushed out of my daughter's home, being labeled a burden too slow for their lives, was a gift wrapped in kindness. I sat very still, the kitchen blurring around the edges of my vision. I could hear the refrigerator humming louder, the clock ticking in my ear like a taunt. For a moment, I wanted to plead with them, to remind them of who I had been, to tell them about the nights I stayed awake sewing Halloween costumes by hand, about the mornings I drove Caroline to school after working a full night shift at the diner, to ask if they remembered the woman who had stood at every soccer game, every piano recital cheering with a heart full of pride. But I didn't, because I knew it would not matter. In their eyes, I was no longer the woman who had built a life brick by brick, who had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. I was just someone who moved too slowly through their fast-paced world, someone who didn't fit neatly into the life they had built without me. I forced a smile, small and tight. I see, I said simply. Caroline exhaled, relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. We'll help you look at some places, she offered brightly. Make it as easy as possible. Trevor nodded, as if the matter was settled. The conversation shifted quickly after that. Trevor poured himself a coffee. Caroline packed lunches for the children. Life resumed, as if nothing had happened, as if the foundation of my world hadn't just been casually dismantled at the kitchen table. I sat there for a long time after they left, my hands resting loosely on the table, my coffee long gone cold. The silence grew around me, thick and suffocating. And then, in that heavy, aching quiet, something shifted inside me. Not a breaking, a hardening. I would not plead for a place in their lives. I would not allow them to dictate my worth with half-hearted smiles and careful words. I would not shuffle off to a corner of the world they deemed appropriate for someone as slow as me. They wanted me out. They would get exactly what they asked for, but not in the way they expected, and not at the speed they thought I was capable of. I rose from the table, the legs of the chair scraping softly against the tile floor. There were plans to be made, decisions to be finalized. They had made their move. Now it was time for me to make mine. The days after the conversation on the kitchen table moved with an eerie stillness, a kind of silent agreement hanging heavy in the air. Caroline and Trevor went about their routines, treating me with a brittle politeness that was almost worse than open hostility. Every interaction was lined with careful patience, every word weighed and measured so as not to sound cruel, and yet each moment carried the sharp sting of rejection. It was like being a guest who had overstayed her welcome, but was too stubborn to leave without finishing her coffee. I continued to do what I had always done: cook, clean, fold laundry, but now I did it mechanically, each motion hollow and stripped of warmth. I no longer lingered over meals or tried to start conversations. I no longer asked about the children's school projects or suggested evening walks. I became a shadow, moving silently from one corner of the house to another, unseen and unneeded. The final straw came on a Wednesday afternoon, under a sky so blue it felt almost mocking. Caroline had asked me to watch the children for a few hours while she ran errands. I agreed, of course, glad for the chance to be useful, to feel connected, even briefly. I spent the morning baking cookies with the kids, helping them with homework, listening to their excited chatter about a new video game they were desperate to convince their parents to buy. It was one of those rare days that felt almost normal, almost whole. When Caroline returned, the children ran to greet her, shoving cookies into her hands, chattering over each other. She smiled, hugged them, praised their baking skills, and barely glanced at me. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it was enough to see the kids happy. Later that evening, after dinner, I overheard a conversation that shattered what little peace I had been holding on to. I was folding laundry in the downstairs laundry room, a task that had become my refuge, when I heard Trevor's voice floating down from the kitchen. His tone was sharp, edged with frustration. "She's slowing everything down," he said. "You saw how long it took her to get the kids ready. It's like she's stuck in slow motion." "She means well," Caroline replied, her voice tight with exhaustion. "But it's getting harder, Trevor. I feel like we have another child to take care of." I stood frozen, a damp towel slipping from my hands onto the floor. Another child? That was how they saw me now. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not even as a person who had spent her life building, nurturing, sacrificing. Just another burden. I backed away from the door quietly, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, and retreated to my room. I closed the door gently behind me and stood there in the dim light, the familiar walls pressing in around me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. I stared at the quilt covering the mattress, the one I had sewn with love so many years ago, the stitches neat and even despite my failing eyesight. Each square of fabric held a memory, a piece of a life spent giving all I had to people who now found my very presence inconvenient. The weight of their words settled on my chest, cold and suffocating. I had given them everything: years of love, support, late-night phone calls, emergency babysitting, financial help when Trevor's business stumbled, and now I was reduced to a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be moved aside. It wasn't anger that filled me in that moment. It was clarity, a sudden piercing understanding that no matter how much I loved them, no matter how much I had sacrificed, I would never be anything more to them now than a hindrance. I would not spend another day in a house where my existence was a chore to be endured. I would not let them decide the terms of my life. I sat there for a long time, the house settling into its nighttime hush around me, the distant sound of the television downstairs blending with the ticking clock by my bed. And I made a decision. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. I rose from the bed, my legs steady beneath me. There was no rage, no weeping, no dramatic outburst, only a quiet, determined sense of purpose. If they thought I was too slow to keep up with their lives, they were about to see how quickly I could change mine. I gathered my things methodically, packing only what mattered into the 2 suitcases I had brought with me months ago. I folded my clothes with care, tucked away the few keepsakes that still held meaning. Everything else, the gifts I had given them, the countless small tokens of love and labor, could stay behind. I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need to cling to a life where I was not wanted. I finished packing just as the grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight, a fitting hour for endings. I placed the suitcases by the door of my room and sat once more on the edge of the bed, my heart calm, my mind clear. Tomorrow, while they were out, I would finish what they had begun. They had made their choice. Now it was my turn, and I would not be slow about it. The morning after my decision dawned clear and cool, a thin mist clinging to the edges of the neatly mowed lawns outside. I woke before the first light touched the sky, the air in my small room still heavy with the weight of the choice I had made. But I felt no hesitation, no fear, only a sense of quiet urgency, a calm readiness that settled into my bones like an old companion. I dressed in comfortable clothes, jeans, a simple shirt, sneakers, clothes that would not restrict my movements, practical clothes for a practical task. I tied my hair back in a low knot, slipped my old wedding band onto my finger, and stood for a moment at the window, watching the first rays of light creep across the street. It was a beautiful day for change. Caroline and Trevor had left early for work, rushing out the door in a cloud of busy footsteps and half-finished conversations. The children were at school. I was alone in the house, a fact that no longer felt isolating but liberating. I moved methodically through the rooms, starting in the master bedroom. I began with their clothes, pulling dresses and suits from the closets, folding them neatly into piles. I packed Trevor's expensive golf clubs, Caroline's designer handbags, the boxes of shoes that lined the floor. I worked quickly but carefully, treating their belongings with a respect they had long since ceased to offer me. Each item I packed felt like another brick removed from the wall they had built between us. The guest room was next. Ironic, really, considering how I had become the perpetual guest in their home. I gathered spare linens, decorative pillows, unopened wedding gifts that had been collecting dust for years. I loaded them into boxes, stacking them neatly near the front door. I moved to the living room, wrapping framed photographs, vases, and other trinkets in old newspapers I found in the garage. The house began to empty, piece by piece, the walls slowly shedding the life they had built atop the foundation I had once laid for them. When I reached the kitchen, I paused for a moment, my hands resting on the cool granite countertops. This room had once been the heart of my own home, filled with the smells of fresh bread, stews bubbling on the stove, children's laughter echoing off the walls. Here it had become a place of silent judgments and awkward meals. I packed up the dishes, the silverware, the gadgets they insisted on buying but rarely used. I cleared the pantry of their organic cereals and imported teas. I wiped down the counters until they gleamed. Every action was deliberate, purposeful. This was not an act of anger. It was an act of reclamation. Once the main floor was packed and organized, I moved to the garage. It was cluttered with tools Trevor never used, boxes Caroline meant to donate but never did, bicycles the children had outgrown. I sorted through it all, separating what could go and what should stay. I left their junk in a pile by the trash cans and loaded the rest into the driveway. By noon, the front yard was a maze of boxes, bags, and carefully stacked belongings. Neighbors passing by slowed their cars, craning their necks to see the spectacle unfolding on the manicured lawn. I paid them no mind. Let them wonder. Let the whispers start. I had nothing to hide. I rented a small storage unit the night before, a modest space in a facility across town. I had no intention of throwing their things away. I would store them neatly, responsibly, and leave the key with a polite note. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for closure. I called a moving service, explaining that I needed help transporting a house full of belongings to a unit. They promised to arrive within the hour. I sat on the porch steps, sipping a glass of water, feeling the sun warm my face as I waited. While I waited, I thought about Harold. I thought about the promises we had made to each other when we were young and foolish and full of dreams. We had vowed to build a life rooted in kindness, respect, and love. I realized now that somewhere along the line, that life had fractured, not because of time or tragedy, but because the people we had given our hearts to had stopped honoring those values. It hurt less than I expected. The movers arrived, a team of two young men with strong arms and easy smiles. They asked no questions as they loaded the boxes and furniture into the truck. I offered them lemonade, and they accepted gratefully, chatting about the weather and the upcoming football season as they worked. It took less than 2 hours to empty the house. When they were done, I handed them the address of the storage unit and followed them there in my car. We unloaded everything swiftly, stacking the boxes neatly inside the unit. I paid them with cash I had set aside for emergencies, thanking them sincerely for their help. When I returned to the house, it felt different, hollow, echoing, but not sad. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for this, yearning to breathe again. I walked through each room one last time, running my fingers along the walls, the door frames, the empty spaces where memories once lived. I left a small envelope on the kitchen counter, tucked neatly under the ceramic rooster that Caroline had insisted on keeping from my old house. Inside was the key to the storage unit and a short note. I moved your belongings to storage. The unit is paid for 6 months. Take care. Nothing more. No explanations. No apologies. No accusations. Just the truth, simple and unadorned. I grabbed my suitcase from my room, the same battered suitcase that had carried me into this house months ago, and wheeled it out to the car. As I pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, a place that no longer belonged to me, nor I to it. Ahead of me stretched an open road, a new life waiting to be claimed. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and smiled. They had underestimated me. They thought I was slow. They thought wrong. The day unfolded with a peculiar sense of peace. After everything was packed, stored, and cleared, I spent the afternoon in the small cafe a few blocks from the storage unit. I sat near the window, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, my mind strangely quiet. There was no gnawing anxiety, no second guessing. I had done what needed to be done, and now there was only the inevitability of what would come next. I watched the world move past the glass, children riding bikes, couples walking dogs, the steady pulse of a neighborhood wrapped in its own small dramas. For the first time in a long time, I realized that I was no longer waiting for anyone's approval. I had stopped waiting to be invited into someone else's life. I was simply living mine. When the afternoon sun began to tilt toward evening, I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip, and made my way back toward the house. I parked a few houses down, far enough away that they wouldn't immediately notice the car. I didn't want to be inside when Caroline and Trevor returned. I wanted the silence of the empty house to greet them first. I waited, watching from the shade of a neighbor's old oak tree, feeling the anticipation settle in my chest like a bird fluttering its wings. It was just after 6 o'clock when their SUV turned onto the street. I could see them even from my distance. Caroline, animated behind the wheel, her hands gesturing as she spoke, and Trevor, half listening as he scrolled through his phone. They looked tired, impatient, wrapped up in their world where I had become an afterthought. They pulled into the driveway, and for a moment, everything was still. Then Caroline stepped out of the car. I watched the change come over her face. The confusion first, a slight narrowing of her eyes as she took in the barren porch, the empty flower pots, the starkness of the front windows. Trevor followed, squinting toward the house. They exchanged a few words, sharp, clipped. I imagined the questions already forming on their tongues. Had they been robbed? Was there a mistake? Why did their home look abandoned? Caroline approached the front door cautiously, fumbling with her keys, glancing back over her shoulder at Trevor. He motioned for her to hurry up, his posture tense. The door swung open, and even from where I stood, I could almost feel the shock roll off them like a wave. The house was empty, completely, utterly empty. No framed photos on the walls, no couches, no dining table, no carefully curated decor, nothing but bare floors and echoes. They stepped inside, their bodies rigid, their heads swiveling as they took in the devastation of absence. I stayed hidden, leaning against the rough bark of the oak tree, watching, waiting. It didn't take long before Caroline spotted the envelope on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, her hands trembling slightly, and ripped it open. I could see her mouth move as she read the short message, her expression twisting from confusion to disbelief to anger in the span of a few seconds. Trevor hovered near her, trying to read over her shoulder, his face flushing with frustration. I wished I could have heard the exact words they spoke then, but I didn't need to. I knew them. How could she? What the hell are we supposed to do now? Is this even legal? They would scramble for answers, for explanations, for someone to blame other than themselves. They would talk about betrayal, about ungratefulness, about how unfair it was. But deep down, they would know. They had pushed me aside, dismissed me, discarded me as inconvenient and obsolete. They just never expected that I would leave on my own terms. They never expected that I would have the audacity to reclaim my dignity without their permission. I watched Caroline sink onto the now bare floor of the living room, the envelope crumpled in her hand. Trevor paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, his phone already pressed to his ear, probably calling moving companies, storage units, lawyers. None of it would change the fact that the house was no longer theirs to command. It had been a home once. Now it was just a hollow shell, a monument to choices made and kindness lost. I waited until they were fully inside before I slipped away, walking back toward my car with slow, deliberate steps. There was no triumph in my heart, no gloating sense of victory, only relief, only the clean, cool satisfaction of knowing that I had not let them diminish me, that I had chosen to walk away before they could push me out. As I drove toward my new apartment, I passed the familiar landmarks of the neighborhood, the school where Caroline had once won a spelling bee, the park where Trevor had proposed under a canopy of autumn leaves. I remembered those days, sweet and sharp, and I mourned them briefly, the way one might mourn a childhood friend who had grown into a stranger. I carried the memories with me, but I did not let them anchor me to a place where I no longer belonged. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow. A new chapter was beginning, and this time I would be the one writing it. The first night in my new place was filled with a different kind of silence. It wasn't the cold, brittle quiet of feeling unwanted. It was a peaceful emptiness, like the deep exhale after holding my breath too long. I sat on the edge of the bed in my small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, a few unpacked boxes stacked neatly against the wall. There was no grand furniture, no expensive decorations, no polished floors gleaming under overhead lights. Just four walls, a few belongings, and a sense of ownership I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as I stared out the window at the empty parking lot, illuminated by the yellow glow of streetlights, I knew I needed to close the last door properly. It wasn't enough to walk away physically. I had to say goodbye to the life I had tried to preserve, to the people I had loved beyond reason, even when they had made it clear that my love was no longer enough. The next morning, I woke early, as had become my habit. I made a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, sitting at the small kitchen table that looked out onto the quiet courtyard. I let the morning sun warm my face, feeling it seep into my skin and bones, and I made a decision. I would visit the old house one last time, not to argue, not to explain, just to say farewell to the part of my life that had already ended long before I packed my first box. I drove slowly through the familiar streets of the neighborhood. The trees lining the sidewalks had begun to change color, their leaves turning shades of amber and red, a reminder that nothing living stays the same forever. I passed the small park where Caroline had played as a child, her pigtails flying as she raced toward the swings. I passed the grocery store where I had once spent Saturday mornings buying ingredients for family dinners no one seemed to remember now. When I pulled up to the house, I stayed in the car for a moment, watching it from a distance. It looked the same as it always had, neatly kept, picture perfect. But there was a stiffness to it now, a stillness that hadn't been there before. It was no longer a home, it was just a structure. I stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes. I didn't carry anything with me. I had no letters to deliver, no speeches to give, just myself, and the quiet conviction that I owed it to my past to say goodbye properly. The front door was locked, of course, but that didn't matter. I wasn't there to go inside. I stood on the porch, my hand resting lightly on the faded wooden railing, and closed my eyes. I remembered the Christmases spent huddled around the fireplace, laughing at Harold's terrible jokes. I remembered Caroline's first steps on the living room rug, the way her tiny fingers had clutched at the air as she stumbled toward me. I remembered late nights sewing Halloween costumes, early mornings packing school lunches, countless days of ordinary, breathtaking love. None of it was here anymore. It had lived inside me all along. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but the tears didn't come. What I felt instead was a deep, aching gratitude for the good years, for the lessons learned, even for the pain that had finally forced me to choose myself. I touched the door lightly with the tips of my fingers, a silent benediction, and then turned away. As I walked back down the driveway, I caught sight of Caroline standing at the window, her face pale and stricken behind the glass. She didn't open the door. She didn't call out to me. We simply looked at each other across the distance of all the choices and all the silences that had brought us to this place. For a moment, I wondered if she felt regret. If she thought about all the times I had stayed up late to soothe her nightmares, all the mornings I had sat in crowded gymnasiums cheering louder than anyone else, if she remembered how I had loved her, not because I had to, but because it was as natural and necessary to me as breathing. But then the moment passed, and I realized it didn't matter. Regret is a private burden. She would have to carry it or not carry it, just as I had carried my own heartbreak quietly for so many years. I smiled, a small, sad smile meant only for myself, and got into my car. I didn't look back as I pulled away from the curb. The drive home was different this time, lighter somehow. The street seemed wider, the sky a little clearer. I turned on the radio and let the music fill the car, a simple country tune about starting over. I found myself humming along without even thinking. When I reached my apartment, I parked the car and sat for a moment, letting the engine tick into silence. This was home now, not because it was grand or impressive or filled with things, but because it was mine. I gathered my purse, locked the car, and walked inside. Jasper, the tabby I had adopted on a whim from the local shelter, greeted me at the door with a sleepy meow. I scooped him up, burying my face in his warm fur, feeling a sense of comfort I hadn't known I missed. I set him down and wandered to the small balcony, stepping out into the soft evening air. Below, the courtyard was quiet, a few neighbors sitting on benches, chatting and laughing. I leaned against the railing, watching them, feeling not like an outsider, but simply a newcomer finding her place. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had chosen, and it was enough. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze lift my hair, and whispered a quiet goodbye to the past. It had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Ahead of me lay a future stitched not from obligations or guilt, but from freedom and hope and the simple, stubborn joy of being alive. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to meet it. The first week in my new home unfolded like a slow and careful unwrapping of a long forgotten gift. I woke up each morning to the gentle light pouring through my modest bedroom window, the air crisp and clean with the scent of dew and budding flowers from the small courtyard below. There was no one knocking on my door, no heavy sighs waiting in the hallway, no carefully constructed conversations where I had to watch every word I said. It was just me and the silence and the freedom to fill each day however I pleased. I took my time settling in. I didn't rush to unpack every box, didn't force myself to immediately decorate or organize. I let the space breathe around me, getting to know the rhythm of my own life again, not one tethered to someone else's expectations. I hung a few framed photographs, one of Harold and me on a windy beach decades ago, one of Caroline when she was a little girl, her face beaming with pure, uncomplicated joy. Despite everything, those memories still belong to me, and they still brought a soft warmth rather than pain. In the mornings, I sipped coffee on the small balcony overlooking the courtyard. Jasper, my tabby, would curl at my feet, his purrs blending with the distant sounds of the city waking up. A garbage truck rumbling by, a neighbor greeting another with a cheerful good morning, the faint chatter of children walking to school. It was not the grand life Caroline and Trevor lived, with their sprawling house and gleaming cars, but it was a life that felt entirely, blessedly mine. I explored the neighborhood on foot, reacquainting myself with the simple pleasures of a walk without purpose. I found a bakery 2 blocks over that made the most incredible sourdough bread, each loaf crusty on the outside and pillowy inside. I discovered a small independent bookstore tucked away between a laundromat and a barber shop, its shelves crammed with novels and cookbooks and poetry collections. The woman who ran it, Elise, wore thick glasses and colorful scarves and talked about books the way some people talk about old lovers, with reverence and fondness and a touch of mischief. Elise and I struck up a friendship quickly. It had been years since I had connected with someone new, not out of obligation, but out of shared interest. She introduced me to a local book club, a small group of women who met once a month over tea and too many pastries. They welcomed me without hesitation, asking about my favorite authors and laughing easily at my dry jokes. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt seen, not as someone's aging mother, not as a burden, but as a whole person with stories and opinions and a future still unwritten. I also found a community center that offered art classes, yoga for beginners, and gardening workshops. I signed up for a pottery class on a whim, recalling how much I had loved working with my hands when I was younger. The first session was a mess. My bowl collapsed into a lopsided lump, but I laughed harder that night than I had in years. The clay stuck under my fingernails, the ache in my arms from kneading and shaping, the sheer silliness of it all. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I had been missing. Back at home, I started small projects that brought me joy. I planted a few pots of herbs on the balcony: basil, rosemary, thyme. Their fragrance filled the air every time the breeze stirred, a living reminder that growth, however slow, was still possible. I knitted a new blanket, each stitch a meditation, a quiet reclaiming of the patience that had once been used only to serve others, but was now being spent on myself. The apartment itself began to change too, reflecting the life blooming within it. I found secondhand furniture, a worn but comfortable armchair, a kitchen table just big enough for two, and painted the walls in soft colors: pale blue for the bedroom, a warm sandy beige for the living room. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about creating a space that felt safe, welcoming, and utterly mine. Sometimes I thought of Carolyn and Trevor. I wondered how they were managing, how they explained the emptiness of their house to curious friends and neighbors. I wondered if they missed me, even fleetingly, but those thoughts came less and less frequently, like distant waves that lapped at the shore but never pulled me under. I didn't hate them. I no longer burned with the anger that had once driven me to pack up their lives and move them onto the street. I simply understood them now: their limitations, their fears, their need to move faster, lighter, freer, even if it meant shedding the people who had helped them get where they were. It was their choice to make, and it had been mine to walk away. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with Jasper purring in my lap and a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, I realized I was happy. Not the giddy, fleeting happiness of new love or sudden fortune, but the deep, steady kind that comes from knowing you have survived what was meant to break you and have built something beautiful from the ruins. The stars blinked above me in the velvet sky, and the soft hum of life around me, neighbors chatting, distant music from an open window, the rustle of leaves, felt like a lullaby. This was my life now, not a consolation prize, not a reluctant afterthought, but a choice I had made with open eyes and an open heart. A life where I was not an inconvenience, not a burden, not a ghost haunting someone else's dreams. I was Barbara Miller, 68 years old, resilient, whole, and home at last.